Hey guys, so it seems necessary in embarking on our next step, which is tragedy, specifically the epic in this case, that we have a little bit less of just hashing things out in writing, and that you have a bit more information about what you're getting yourself into in some level, and what Homer is actually doing in the Iliad. So many of you probably have heard about the Iliad, maybe have seen the movie Troy. Homer was a Greek poet. Not much else is known about him. He may have been blind. People think that he was. But the thing that seems most significant about Homer is what he's capable of doing with the topic of war. So the Iliad is an epic. It takes place in Medea Res, and to be honest, most of the things that you probably know about the Trojan War don't actually happen in the Iliad. Many of you may know about the Trojan horse, or may even know about how Achilles, the main character, eventually dies. None of that happens within the Iliad. The Iliad is actually a very, very short period of time. It might span 10 days, but even that might be a bit long. So what the Iliad is it starts out in Medea Res, as I said, which is in the middle of things, and it begins in the middle of the Trojan War. The Trojan War has been waging on for quite some time. The Trojan War happens in Troy, so that's important to know because one of the things that you're going to see is that there are two sides to the war, and Homer does a really good job of providing equal weight to the sides so that we can really see the toll that war takes on people. You have the Trojans who are on their homeland, and that's where the war is being fought. The main character on that end is Hector and his brother Paris, although you won't see Paris very much because he's kind of a sissy. He doesn't fight. He just creates the war and then shacks up with his girl Helen, and we don't hear from him much. And then you have the other side of the war, which is Achilles and the Achaeans, and they're fighting overseas. And there's a lot to be said about when you're not fighting on your own turf, how that affects your feelings about the war, and how it affects your overall involvement, your sentimentality towards things. And so we do get both sides of that, and that's actually really nice to see. So the war began, and it's really a silly story, and if you remember back to studying Greek gods and heroes your freshman year, you'll remember that the gods are incredibly petty. And so the war begins because Zeus and his wife Hera are throwing a banquet. They literally run out of dishes, and so there's one person they cannot invite. And this one person gets really angry. It's a god. It's a goddess, actually. She gets really angry, and she decides to crash the party anyway. And she shows up with this golden apple that says, "To the fairest." And now, remember, Greek gods are incredibly petty. So you have 4 women vying for this thing that says, "To the fairest." You have Hera, Zeus's wife, who says that she is the fairest because she is basically the head goddess, and she therefore is just better than everybody else. You have Aphrodite, who says she's the fairest, she's the goddess of love, and you have her sister Athena, who says she's the fairest, she's the goddess of wisdom, and they're both the daughters of Zeus in some way. Not necessarily Hera's children, but that's complicated. And so, I'm sorry, I think I told you that there were 4. There's 3 women, right? So 3 women vying for this thing. Zeus is smart. He's smart enough to know that he's not going to be the individual to decide between his daughters and his wife. So he says, "Look, I'm not going to be the judge of this thing." And so they take a very pretty young man. He is the Prince of Troy. His name is Paris. And they decide that he is going to be the objective judge of this ridiculous contest. And so Paris kind of panders a little bit with the women. They all offer him something. Hera offers him everything, anything under the sun. She's Hera, she's the goddess of all. You have Athena, who promises him, wisdom beyond belief. And then you have Aphrodite, who promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. Problem is, most beautiful woman in the world, is actually married. And she is married to the king of the Achaeans. Now we start to see the story unfold. And so Paris, being a man, decides, hey, what do I need wisdom for? I'm going to go with the hot woman. He chooses Aphrodite. Aphrodite, in turn, has to deliver Helen to him. And under this kind of guise where Paris is supposed to be a guest in Menelaus' home, Aphrodite helps him to steal Helen away, and that begins the war. And you may have heard of Helen as the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, this is Helen. This is Helen of Troy. She was a beautiful woman, the most beautiful woman ever, right? And so Paris runs away with her, and he shacks up in his Trojan castle, so to speak, and he leaves his brother, Hector, to kind of pick up the pieces. So this is how the war begins. So at the very beginning of this war, there's just this feeling of futility. Like, what is the point? Why are we doing this? And so Menelaus, who was Helen's, husband, is angry. It's an issue of pride for him. His wife has been stolen right under his roof, and the irony on some level is that Helen doesn't really want to return. Menelaus is an old guy. He wasn't a whole lot of fun. Paris is young, good-looking. They have a good time together. And so throughout the story, you also see this strange feeling where Helen's also torn. Helen's, should I return? Should I not return? I'm kind of having fun here, but oh my gosh, I've started a war, right? But essentially, she doesn't do the right thing. She stays with Paris until this whole thing is kind of over. And so you have Menelaus, who's angry, and his brother Agamemnon is the leader of the army. And so now you have two things going on. You have two brothers who are essentially uninvolved with the war, even though they're the main crux of it. So you have Menelaus, who, it's his wife, it's his war, but he's not really fighting in it exactly. He's got his brother Agamemnon and his army, and that's really the person who's commanding the troops and who's going overseas and who's really fighting. And then you've got Paris, who's shacked up with Helen, who's also not fighting, and his brother Hector, who already has a wife and kids, and all of his brothers, is the individual who's left to pick up all the pieces. So this is the backdrop for the Iliad. So the Iliad picks up years into the war. The war has been waging on for years, and you have a very tired Greek army. And so it literally begins with Menelaus and Agamemnon kind of playing a hoax on their army and just kind of saying, all right, you know what, guys, let's just call it quits. Let's just go home. And you see that this army is so tired and they want to go home, and they run to the ships, only to be told that that's not really what's happening here. They were just kind of testing their morale, but at this point morale is so very low. So that's the Greek side. Their leader, though it's Agamemnon, is actually really their star player. It's Achilles. Achilles is a young man who is half god, half human. You may have heard the story of Achilles, how he's born, and when he's born, his mother, who's a goddess, dips him into the river of eternity, but she does it by his ankles, so his whole self is considered immortal, except for the Achilles heel, right? That's the one part that can destroy him. And so he's fast, he is sharp, he's the best soldier they've got, and he has been destroying the Trojan side. The Greek side's winning, but they're still exhausted because this is a long war. And so we start out with this image of how tired they are, how long this thing has been going on, and how much they want it to end. We also start out with the rage of Achilles, and that's, if you just look at those first lines, it's sing of the rage of Achilles. So this story is, in some level, a story about anger and a story about the consequences of anger. And when things get to a certain point, is there a turning back point, or is it just, you just keep going? And so why is Achilles angry? Well, Achilles is angry because he, again, is the star of the war. He knows that. He's, and he's put everything into this thing, and he knows it's not his war, and he's angry about that. But he's really angry because you have, when they fight, and this is kind of sadly one of the byproducts of war usually, when they pillage a city, they take the women, and they take the jewels, they take everything that is of value, they disperse it among themselves. And so at this point they've come back from fighting in part of this war, and they've just pillaged a city, and they've all taken a war prize, and that's actually a female. So you've got Chryses and Brises. Those are the two main war prizes. Brises has been given to Achilles. Chryses has been given to Agamemnon. And you're going to keep seeing that there's these little epitaphs, like the girl with the bright eyes, or swift-footed runner, or helmet-flashing Hector. The gray-eyed Athena is one of the epitaphs. You may have remembered something like this in your study of Beowulf as related to kennings. The idea behind it is when you have an epic and you have so many characters and there's this long storyline, one of the things that the oral poets did before they were written down, it did get translated into the writing, is that they would have these little things to just keep reminding the listener of who the character is and a specific trait that's related to them. So you've got the girl with the bright eyes, and her father is a priest of Apollo. And so the priest of Apollo has good connection to Apollo, obviously. And he's been praying to Apollo, and he's been asking for the return of his daughter. And Apollo wants to grant that. And so the father comes to Menelaus and Agamemnon, and he says, "Look, I'll give you anything at all. Just give me back my daughter." Apollo kind of sanctioned this, and really whatever you want, oxes, anything. And so Agamemnon says no. And he doesn't just say no. If you look really specifically at the language of how he responds, it's really atrocious. I mean, he basically tells the guy that not only is he not going to return the daughter, but she's going to die a slave to his bed. I mean, he's really, really over the top. And the Greek army doesn't really agree with this. The Greek army feels like, this guy's got connections to Apollo, maybe you should return him, this isn't a good idea. But Agamemnon, in his own rage and his own pride, refuses. And so we start with the plague, right? And this is what's going on. So you've got a plague. Apollo is literally just shooting arrows at the Greek army, and people are dying. Bad things are happening, and nothing really bad has happened to the Greek army yet, because Achilles is so amazing. They're tired, but they've been victorious. This is the first time that they're not being victorious, and it's not even a result of the war. It's a result of Agamemnon's pride. And so all of these arrows are being shot from the sky, and Agamemnon sends a seer to find out, why is this happening, as if he can't figure it out. And it is he annoyed the priest of Apollo, and Apollo's responding. And so he decides he has to give back the girl. It's, he doesn't really have a choice anymore. And so he has to return the girl. And now that he's returned the girl, he has no war prize. And he is angry. He feels slighted. He's the leader of this army. It's a status symbol. This is bad. And so he decides he's going to take somebody else's war prize. He doesn't necessarily decide he's taking Achilles. He discusses maybe Odysseus's. He actually goes through, most of his good guys. But Achilles is the one who comes off most strong, as in, you cannot take my war prize. I have fought too hard in this war. This is my war. And so, again, clashing of pride. That's who Agamemnon goes after, and he takes Achilles' war prize. As a result of the war prize being taken, Achilles says, "That's it, I'm done. I'm out of this war." And if you look at the specific language it gets really dicey because Achilles very clearly challenges his commander and creates a schism within the whole army, and he is the point that the Greeks are now going to be on a downward spiral because Achilles has taken himself out. So that's the Greek side of the war. This is where we start, in Media Res. The other side of the war, the Trojan side of the war, you have Hector, who is a family guy. His wife Andromache is home with him most of the time, and his son Ajax is also there. I just called him Ajax. I think it's Astyanax. My apologies. But he, Hector is where we really see the two sides of the war. We see a man who is compelled to fight for his country, and to protect his people. This is happening on his turf. He literally is at the gates of the city trying to keep the Greeks out so that he can protect his family and his people. This is where you get the story of the Trojan horse, right? How do they eventually infiltrate the gates? It's through the Trojan horse. But you don't get that in the Iliad. You get that in a later work, the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil. And so, with Hector, we see most poignantly the two parts of war that Homer is hashing out here. You see that war is inevitable, and when involved in it, it's fight or flight. You have to defend or you have to run away. Paris chooses to run away, and he doesn't get a lot of respect throughout this epic. Hector chooses to fight, and as a response, he is probably one of the most noble characters that we see in the entire epic. But he's torn because he's leaving his family. As much as he's protecting them, he's leaving them to fight. All of his brothers at this point, except for Paris, have already been killed by Achilles. So they know exactly what they're walking into. But he just feels compelled. He has to fight. Homer is one of the greatest writers because he captures this dichotomy of the fascination with violence along with the terrible qualities of violence. And I'm going to read to you a passage from, this is the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and this is volume A. It's the part that covers Homer. It's the earliest section. And the reason I'm telling you where this is and what this information is that these books, all of the ones that we're going to be using as we work through Homer, and we work through Dante, and we work through some of the real classics, they're all available in the library. So the two works that we're really going to be looking at is this one, and there's another book called The War That Killed Achilles. And both of those you can ask Mrs. Sparnroff about. You have access to them. Should you choose to use something like this in your research paper, you have the secondary sources of the introductions and the critique and things like that. So this is from the first one that I mentioned. It's page 115 of the work. And I want you to just think about what Homer's capable of doing here. And it says, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, Homer captures the true nightmare quality of battle, in which men perform monstrous actions with the same matter-of-fact efficiency they display in their normal occupations, and the simile reproduces the grotesque appearance of violent death. Homer's lines combine the human revulsion from the horror of violent death and the human attraction to the excitement of violent action. And so, as you're reading, especially when we get to one of the last scenes, like the real gruesome death scene, you're going to see that Homer doesn't sugarcoat things. Homer is descriptive. He is graphic. He is presenting war in all of its gore, in all of its horror. But he's also showing us that there is a certain adrenaline that goes with fighting. And there are things that men will do that they wouldn't normally do, but they do almost without a second thought, and they do almost without a sense of morality or a sense of boundary. And that this is indeed part of war. One of the main questions that has come up in the study of Homer's the Iliad is, does Homer condone war? Is he glorifying it? If you've seen the movie Troy, you may have an opinion about that, but as you're reading, I want you to just kind of pay attention to how Homer depicts war in all of its destructiveness, and also in its beauty, in a sense, in its terrible beauty, to quote the text. I'm going to read to you another piece from this that just food for thought of things I want you to think of as we're working through this text. And it's also at the bottom of page 115. This tragic action is the center of the poem. And now the tragic action is when Achilles pulls out, his best friend dies. But it is surrounded by scenes that remind us that organized destruction of war, though an integral part of human life, is still only part of it. The yearning for peace and its creative possibilities is never far below the surface. These two poles of the human condition, war and peace, with their corresponding aspects of human nature, the destructive and the creative, are implicit in every situation and statement of the poem. They are put before us in symbolic form, and with scenes of human life in both peace and war. Whether these two sides of life could ever be integrated or even reconciled is a question that the Iliad raises but cannot answer. So as we're studying this, I want us to think about the human condition. I want us to think about the plight of man. I want us to think about the consequences of rage. I want us to think about the dichotomy of free will and of fate, because you do have a text here that has this underlying awareness that the gods are involved, and not only involved, but that the gods are really the cause of all of this nonsense. And so if the gods are the cause of all of this nonsense, and the gods are so involved, to what extent does man actually have control over his own destiny? And to what extent does Achilles have other options? When we study a little bit later, I would say maybe 2 days into our study of the Iliad, I'm going to read to you a passage that isn't in your text, where Achilles is crying to his mother on the side of the river. And I want you to just kind of think about this great, great soldier having been reduced to this somewhat pathetic piece of a man, and what he keeps lamenting is the idea that he's doomed, that regardless of what he does, he's doomed. And I think this is something else that we have Homer putting right in front of us, and this is something that we studied throughout our entire short story unit, is that by being human, part of our human condition is always being aware of our own mortality, and this idea that death is inevitable. You can't avoid it. And so when you're thinking about war, I think that's something that we really have to consider.